Who were the three judges that immediately followed Jephthah, and what are they known for? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Judges on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Judges 12, verses 8 to 15, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Judges 12, verse 8, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Judges chapter 12, beginning at verse 8. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons, and he gave away 30 daughters in marriage, and brought in 30 daughters from elsewhere for his sons. He judged Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem. After him, Elon the Zebulunite judged Israel. He judged Israel 10 years. And Elon the Zebulunite died and was buried at Aijalon in the country of Zebulun. After him, Abdon the son of Hillel the Pirathonite judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. He judged Israel 8 years. Then Abdon the son of Hillel the Pirathonite died and was buried in Pirathon, in the land of Ephraim, in the mountains of the Amalekites. In our last lesson, we completed our look at the judge named Jephthah. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, and when we first met him, he was what we would call a pirate, for he had been banished by his people for his parentage. But alas, when enemies strike and you have nobody who could help you defeat them, amends can be made, and so Jephthah was called to deliver Israel from the hands of the Ammonites. God was with Jephthah, and the Ammonites were defeated. However, Jephthah, as we saw, was not a perfect man. He was a man of faith, but he was not a perfect man. At first, again, he was a pirate, which is just another way of saying a thief. He acted impulsively in vowing to offer a burnt offering to God of the first thing that came out of his house, should God give him victory, which resulted in his daughter having to be placed in the service of the tabernacle and remain a virgin for her entire life. And since Jephthah has no sons, his lineage would die out with him. But Jephthah was still a man of faith, for he trusted in the Lord and depended on his grace in his life to carry him through. We need to depend on God the same way, for we are not perfect people either. Now, just because we're not perfect doesn't mean that we should accept sin in our lives or think that God does, for he doesn't. But God is ready and willing to forgive his children when they repent and seek his forgiveness. Men like Jephthah can teach us that lesson. Coming now to verses 8 through 15, we have the judges that immediately follow Jephthah. We can know that they immediately follow Jephthah because the phrase after him appears to introduce each of the next 3 judges. We determine from the internal evidence from the book of Judges that the battle of Jephthah with the Ammonites took place in around 1100 BC because Jephthah tells us that the Ammonites had waited for 300 years since Israel had settled in Canaan and Gilead to contest the land. Jephthah judged Israel for 6 years after that, and so at the death of Jephthah, we said it was around 1094 BC. If you notice, with us now coming to 1094 BC, we're now within 50 years of the beginning of the era of the kings, meaning that some of the events of 1 Samuel will be taking place concurrently with what we're going to be reading during this period of Judges. The judge that immediately followed Jephthah was Ibzan. Ibzan was from Bethlehem, a city that we automatically think of as being in Judah because we associate this city with the birth of Jesus. But let's remember, there was also a Bethlehem in the tribe of Zebulun, according to Joshua 19:15. So which one is it? I'm inclined to believe that we're talking about the Bethlehem in Zebulun. Why? Well, there are a couple reasons for that. One, when we're talking about Bethlehem of Judah, the town is usually identified as such when it is necessary for the reader to know which Bethlehem we're talking about. And two, the other 2 judges in this section are going to be judging in northern Israel, so it is likely that Ibzan is being mentioned here as judging in the north. Otherwise, it would have been clarified so. And third, we're going to see in chapter 13 through 16 that there is turmoil going on in southern Israel with the Philistines at this time. And so if Ibzan is judging in the south, then we would have expected this to have been mentioned. However, if Ibzan was judging in Bethlehem and Zebulun, this silence would make sense. As far as any other information about Ibzan, the only other thing that we know is that he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, likely meaning that he had multiple wives and concubines like Gideon did, and that he judged Israel for 7 years. We do not know if any nations came against Israel at this time that he fought, and so we will not speculate further. When he died and was buried, our timeline now sits at around 1087 BC. After Ibzan came Elon the Zebulunite. We know even less about Elon than we did about Ibzan. He judged Israel for 10 years before he died and was buried at Ajalon. This Ajalon is not in the valley of the tribe of Dan near Judah, but within the boundaries of the tribe of Zebulun. With Elon's death, our timeline comes down to 1077 BC. And then finally, we have Abdon, the son of Hillel the Pirathonite. Pirathon is in the land of Ephraim, making Abdon an Ephraimite. Like Ibzan, Abdon had many sons, 40 in total, along with 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys, meaning that they were quite wealthy. I am reminded of Jair from chapter 10, whose sons also rode on donkeys in a show of their status and wealth. He judged Israel for 8 years before dying, bringing our timeline down to 1070 BC. 1070 BC is going to represent the end of our timeline for this book, as the story of Samson will be occurring during this time period and is likely over before Abdon even becomes judge in Ephraim. Thus, even though Samson is the final judge in the book of Judges, it could be that Abdon was the final judge who chronologically judged in the book of Judges, with Samuel being the final judge in Israel before the period of the kings. If this is true, then the timeline of the book of Judges brings us to about 18 years before the era of the kings that would begin with King Saul. Like with the other 2 judges before him, we don't know that much about Abdon, nor if he fought any nations who afflicted Israel, but we do know that he was buried in the land of Ephraim, in the mountains of the Amalekites. It is peculiar that the mountains in Ephraim are called the mountains of the Amalekites, but perhaps it is so because they're commemorating a previous battle won that we don't have a record of, much like we have the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb in chapter 7, commemorating the victory over those princes of Midian who were killed. So although we can't prove it, that seems like a likely possibility, for the Amalekites are known to be living somewhere else at this time and not here. We'll take up with the story of Samson, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Judges 13, verses 1 to 10, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.